Next, we come to a strange headline that we've lumped together in a broader package, um, which we are describing as being examining the function of history and uncomfortable truths contained therein. And this one is interesting because it really jumped out at me because it begs a very obvious question when you read this particular headline. China insists Genghis Khan exhibition not use words. Well, do you want to guess?
Genghis. Ah,
Genghis
100%.
Khan, exactly. Genghis
Yes.
Khan. How do you exhibit about Genghis Khan and then presumably Mongol culture and other bits and bobs floating around that time and place
It's a bit
without
like
using
it's
the
a bit
phrase
like the
Genghis
ministry.
Khan?
It's a bit like the Ministry of Magic holding an exhibition about he who must not be named, isn't it?
Yes, yeah,
You- you-
it's
it's,
remarkable. It's remarkable. So that was in the Guardian, and backing that
yeah.
up, there's the hyperallergenic.com expands a little bit on this. A French museum postpones Genghis Khan exhibition, accusing Chinese authorities of censorship. A museum in
Not.
Nantes, says it decided to pause the exhibition after Chinese authorities asked that names and terms like Genghis Khan, Empire, and Mongol not be used in an exhibition about Genghis Khan, who had a Mongol empire. Like, a History Museum in Western France has postponed the exhibition about Mongol Emperor Genghis Khan for 3 years, citing censorial interference by the Chinese government. Uh, and, and 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 it's interesting because all of these topics,
Mm,
these sorts of ways of talking about the past, and the fact that the past is so
mm,
frequently um, seen as a hot potato from
yeah.
various perspectives and for various reasons, was also highlighted this month with the news that Facebook has finally decided to ban Holocaust denial content on its platform.
Mm,
This is a situation that you've often argued in the past is actually should be similar actually to this month's link of the month. It's a publishing issue, and that Facebook in that sense is allowing people to publish on a platform.
yeah.
And what was the quote? Mark Zuckerberg's thinking had evolved on this issue.
Yeah.
Um, how do you start to navigate this? And should it be the job of historians and archaeologists to avoid upsetting, for example, the People's is it People's Communist Party of China?
The Communist Party of China.
That's it. Yes, to avoid upsetting a
CPC.
foreign government. Um, how do we navigate this? And should it even be our concern?
Well, it is our concern because this has happened.
Yes.
And we're in similar territory here to people who argue about the sponsorship of major events by, for example, fossil fuel companies, which
Hmm.
has been a very live issue, particularly with the British Museum, which has had
Yes.
a sponsorship arrangement with BP, British Petroleum. Um, Here, though, when you're dealing with a national authority, you're dealing with the highest tier of national and international politics. And this is to do with the President Xi's efforts to centralize and homogenize Chinese political and social culture.
Mm.
We're seeing it with the severe allegations of crimes against humanity against the Uyghur Muslims, for example.
Yes.
Which has included allegations that, for example, Ouija mosques have been demolished, um, and, uh,
For which we should say there is extraordinarily compelling evidence. I mean,
there
obviously
is,
we're using the phrase allegations for
yeah,
legal reasons, but there is extraordinarily compelling evidence that
there is a
this is
compelling
happening.
case that the Chinese government has behaved appallingly towards the Ouija Muslims.
Yes.
It is also the case, and as these articles point out, that there is a similar effort going on in Mongolia. For example, replacing the local language in Mongolian schools with Mandarin Chinese.
Hmm. Hmm.
To the idea being that the nation will the entire nation will speak the same language as its first language,
Mm.
um, and uh, and basically try to suppress regional and ethnic identities and replace them with a wider Chinese identity. And this is when Xi is centralizing power into his own hands. He's been made a president for life. The Chinese armed forces are being built up. There's saber rattling going on against Taiwan, um, and the attempts to grab territory, for example, in the South China Sea by a place like the Spratly Islands, where effectively coral reefs are being turned into artificial islands and then turned into air bases for the People's Liberation Army Air Force, and Navy. So this is in a much wider context, and I think we have to take we have to be prepared to take a moral stand here. The issue was over artifacts, I think, that were being borrowed from the Chinese government. And the Chinese government tried to impose those conditions for its cooperation. And to be honest, I think if I was organising an exhibition and any source of potential artifacts, for the sake of argument, tried to impose those kind of conditions on me, the reply will be a politer version of a 2-word reply, beginning with F and ending with F. Because I don't think certainly any academic organisation, museum, gallery, or whatever, that's organising an exhibition, no artifact is so important that it has to sell its soul and independence to be able to show it. And in fact, I'd go further. I would say, I'd do the equivalent of empty chairing. I'd empty showcase or empty space on the wall with an explanation and a photograph, maybe. We were hoping to show this object. Unfortunately, the ex-government imposed a condition of so-and-so which we find unacceptable.
Well, in that context, it would be intolerable. You couldn't exhibit, you couldn't advertise, you couldn't do anything in order to have the object in the building. I suppose to bring it closer to home, then, we're also flagging in this segment a story from a couple of weekends ago now, where the National Trust came under scrutiny, seemingly from charity watchdogs. Apparently were going to get involved over the fact that the National Trust was apparently overstepping its remit, rather than simply narrowly looking after certain artifacts and sites across the country. They were imposing as the Daily Mail says, a woke agenda onto these often stately houses by examining the legacy of, for example, the slave trade and other related issues and human rights violations and so on and so forth through history and problems. I suppose just different aspects of the historical story of these places, and bringing the results of that analysis to public attention. Once again, I find myself wondering. Where should we be in terms of the honest presentation of the past, and once again, seemingly in this instance, very strong hints of undue political influence over what we can and can't say.
Yeah, and I put this together. We alluded to Facebook and the belated ban in overt Holocaust denial. As opposed to debating Holocaust denial, which is a very different thing. That's where we have to be very careful. But okay, the baseline is that under human rights legislation, international and national, certainly in the UK, people have the freedom to believe what they like. What they don't have is the freedom to say things which are damaging to other people.
No.
That's seen as a reasonable compromise in law. So, for example, we have legislation against hate speech, and the discrimination against particular groups in the community, and that is accepted as being a positive evolution of our social systems. How do we acknowledge that in heritage, in exhibitions, in literature, on websites, and so on? I think. If you equate, take the two examples of Holocaust denial and slavery. Holocaust denial is overtly a racist, anti-Semitic school of argument that argues that the murder of over 6 million human beings who happen to be of Jewish heritage and many other people during the Holocaust didn't happen.
Mm.
It's a false argument put forward for political reasons by neo-Nazis, effectively.
By people who ironically would like to enact a Holocaust. I find that
You
I
might
find
say,
that I find that amazing. I really
you,
do. It didn't happen. I mean, we would like
yes,
it to happen, but we.
yes. Well, and there are the infamous T-shirts along with lines of, Hitler didn't try hard enough,
Yeah.
but and that is quite rightly seen as unacceptable. And when it rears its head, I think first of all we have a duty to confront it, and it's something I'm very proud we've done on Pipeline. We've run stories about the neo-Nazi involvement in things like the Hitler escaped in 1945 myth that
Mm.
was run so egregiously in Hunting Hitler,
Mm. Mm.
because that kind of trope plays to the neo-Nazi movement. In fact, there's a very good book just out by Professor Richard Evans about the various post-war Hitler myths, which cites the Hitler escape myth.
Mm.
Also, I'm very proud to say that it also cites Roger Clark's articles that he wrote for Pipeline, so I'm very proud of that. I think it's something I'm passionate that we confront these things. We don't just think they'll go away. I think we have to deal with them. When it comes to slavery, and I can just make the point, and then I'll come, perhaps open up. When it comes to slavery, I put the point: would you deny that slavery happened in the way that you deny in the same way that some people deny that the Holocaust happened?
Mm.
You can't. It did,
Yeah.
and therefore we have a duty to deal with it, not least because it has ripples that extend through history down to today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not to address those, again, will be utterly unacceptable to my mind. How you address it is a matter for endless debate, but I don't think addressing it or not addressing it is an issue. It's a given. You have to deal with it as part of that history, and and it's not the only dark heritage in the culture, particularly of the English-speaking world, and particularly of these islands. I know perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment.
Well, actually, unfortunately, my laptop has decided to crash and restart again. But we can begin this element of
Mm.
the conversation in so much as the the examples that we've chosen are very specific for this segment. In so much as I found it
Mm.
fascinating that on the one hand you had what could be described as an extreme left form of censorship, communist China or whatever, trying to censor a museum in France. On the other hand, you've got people who are arguing that the Holocaust didn't happen, and on yet another hand, what we have is a situation where uh, where people are uncomfortable about the slave trade because of their status in a relatively comfortable worldview, a very relatively comfortable British worldview, which, broadly speaking, is slightly more to the right, possibly certainly than me, for example, and doesn't want to have to be confronted with stories about the slave trade when they visit a National Trust property to get their scone and jam and get their memberships worth. So the reason why we've chosen these is that it highlights the fact that actually the issue here is censorship. It doesn't really matter who's asking you to censor what your work is. It's censorship. It's not necessarily about in this instance us trying to support a particular political perspective. I don't care who you are and how you are asking, but if you're asking archaeologists and historians not to talk about something openly and honestly, then in my opinion you are wrong. And it's fascinating because in this instance there's also another element, and that is the discovery in October of or rather sorry the it was made public, the discovery in October of some Anglo-Saxon remains somewhere in the country. Again, my laptop is playing up, where seemingly a young woman had been uncovered who had in her lifetime had her nose and probably lips and maybe ears cut off. You could tell this because of the way that the bone had reacted to the cutting, and this was deemed to be probably a punishment for adultery. And what was interesting is that this started a conversation on the Facebook page, the Archaeosoup Facebook page, where someone rather crassly, and I think they thought they were being funny, but it wasn't at all amusing when they said, "Oh, you think that they must be Muslim? You know, Muslims do that, don't they?" And this obviously led to a conversation where we're going, "Why would you say that? What are you talking about?" But more to the point, what I found so interesting here is the context of how people can politically or in terms of time remove themselves from uncomfortable truths in
Yeah.
history and present it in such a way that they don't quite understand the fact that what they're looking at is themselves. This woman was probably an ancestor to certainly probably people living in England today, and there she is, part of a society whose morals and punishments for breaking those morals is what we now deem to be abhorrent and
Yeah.
barbaric. The other in this instance, as I pointed out on the page, is us. And so, what are we talking about there? Are we talking about the possibility of us censoring ourselves so as not to
Yeah.
talk about an uncomfortable truth? Once again, it's this issue of the function of history and the fact that it so often contains elements that someone is going to find uncomfortable.
Oh yeah.
You know. Oh, there we go. It's just loaded up now. Study carried out by experts at University College London's Institute for Archaeology.
Mm.
And it's a girl believed to be aged between 15 and 18 years old,
Yeah.
um, who was radiocarbon dated to between AD 776 and 899, and her remains were what started that conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose maybe this segment is kind of a case study and a little bit of advice, I would say, maybe for colleagues, just to to keep on walking the ethical approach to our studies that isn't
And
swayed and uncensored in that sense.
well, I think we have to. Well, also, um, there will be some, probably not many, but there will be some in the heritage community, who will say, "Oh, maybe just back off these things, elide these things a little bit. Maybe don't deal with them so confrontationally." And
Mm,
da, da, da. Or even some who, there are right wing archaeologists who might actually hold with some of those views.
mm, mm.
We're not a homogenous community.
No.
Um, but my take on it would be that you're absolutely right. I think, as I say, and as I said earlier, I think we have a duty both as academics, historians, archaeologists, and as human beings to deal with these areas directly and call them out when they're being used and abused for political reasons.
Mm,
And I think that the case of the National Trust, which came out of an article, front page article on the Daily Telegraph 2 Saturdays ago, what the Telegraph did was concoct a story about the National Trust to fit its anti-woke agenda.
mm,
Anti-woke being a current buzzword on the right.
mm,
Used to be called political correctness. It's now been transmogrified into being woke.
mm,
And they basically invented a story whereby a couple of news lines were manipulated to make it look as though there was a Charities Commission investigation into the National Trust. There is no investigation. The Charities Commission confirmed that.
yes. Yeah.
And the National Trust confirmed afterwards as well that it will continue to tell the stories of its properties in the round.
Mm, mm,
But this is all part and parcel of a general attempt to intimidate and grind down opposition views to a certain kind of our island story narrative where Britain is exceptional and Britain only obtained its empire and grew sugar in the West Indies in order that we could actually free the slaves.
yes.
You know,
Indeed. Mm-hmm.
it's nonsense. It's historical nonsense. It's historically illiterate.
Well, it's revisionist.
It's revisionist, and it can be shown up to be so easily.
Mm,
But it just happens to fit with the zeitgeist of certain parts of the political spectrum at the moment. So this is why I think you say it has to be confronted and dealt with head on. You
yeah.
can't.
Well, the Mail Online headline in its full extent, because
Glory.
they always do multiple line headlines on the website, don't
Yes.
they?
Nothing
National
wrong with
Trust.
that. It's a standard journalistic practice.
Uh, they write a paragraph as a headline. National Trust is facing questions over its purpose by charity regulator after being accused of virtue signalling by insisting volunteers wear LGBT badges or and tweeting its historic links to slavery. Trust sparked a woke row. There you go, buzzword. After tweeting details about buildings links to slaveries, dozens of people have vowed to cancel their membership because the charity is virtue signalling, and regulators are now looking at whether the trust has breached its charitable objects. Um, and yeah, and so the point of this element, I suppose, being that it is current. It is in the Twitter sphere, and the pressure is real. I imagine it can't be nice working at the moment in some of these areas and some of these
No,
for some of these organisations. Um, but I guess certainly from my perspective, I would just say keep treading the righteous path. In so much as if it's not the Daily Mail this week, then next week it's going to be the Chinese government, and if it's not the Chinese
yeah,
government, it's going to be people who collect wellies for a living. There's always going to be someone who's objecting to your work, and I guess I would hope that our colleagues would be able to look at their work and stand by it and its honesty and its integrity, I suppose. Um, Hopefully that's useful anyway, in some way.